In the cold, unyielding theater of the 41st millennium, virtue is not a shield, but a conductor for the most exquisite forms of agony. To be good is to invite the universe to test the structural integrity of your soul, until the moment of inevitable fracture. We are often told that courage is the antithesis of despair. Yet for High Paladin Valerius, courage was merely the fuel. It kept his consciousness burning long enough to witness the systematic erasure of everything he venerated. There exists a terminal point in the trajectory of every hero, where the burden of the celestial ledger outweighs the capacity of the mortal coil to endure. Blind loyalty becomes a cage, and the light of the throne becomes a searing heat that withers the very life tide it was meant to protect. Is it a betrayal to seek the silence of oblivion, when the alternative is an eternity of witnessing the great cleansing of innocence? Or is the ultimate fall merely the final, honest act? The act of a mind that has peered too deeply into the senseless vacuum of the stars and found no echo of divine mercy. The tragedy lies not in the failure of the will, but in the realization that the universe demands a price that no sentient being, no matter how hallowed, can ever truly pay without losing the essence of their humanity. Imagine a suffocating macro shot of a shattered stained glass window within the sanctum of mourning. The camera of history drifts through the microscopic particles of floating ash. Illuminated by the dying ochre light of a binary sunset, we see Valerius kneeling, not in prayer, but in a state of catatonic exhaustion. His venerated ceramite armor, once a mirror of silver perfection, is now a weeping ruin of scorched plates and deeply etched scars. Each mark is a testament to a world he failed to salvage. The soundscape of this memory is dominated by the rhythmic, agonizing hiss of his damaged respirator and the distant, mournful tolling of a bell that rings for a congregation that no longer exists. There is no music in this era, only the howling of a radioactive wind through the ribbed arches of the planetary cathedral. The air is thick with the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of vital essence cooling on the frigid stone floor. He hides his visage behind a cracked death mask, where a single crystalline drop of moisture escapes the optic lens. It is a silent heresy in an age of iron. The cenotaph of Aurelius Prime was not always a planetary-scale mausoleum. It did not always harbor the ghosts of the billion forgotten aspirants. Before the shadow of the Whispering Unmaker fell upon the sector, Aurelius Prime was the crown jewel of the sector's faith. It was a beacon of uncompromising radiance, a primary reliquary for the hallowed bones of ancient saints. The surface was a testament to the unyielding grandeur of the Imperium, a world where devotion was carved into every marble pillar and woven into the very atmospheric scrubbers. High Paladin Valerius stood at the apex of this golden age. He was the Warden of the Silent Relics, a towering avatar of resolve, whose mere presence could quell the rising tides of doubt. In those days, his ceramite armor was pristine, a blinding reflection of the Emperor's supposed grace. He led the planetary defense with a mind as sharp as a diamond, and a spirit unclouded by the corrosive touch of cynicism. Let us delve into the architectural and environmental anatomy of what Aurelius Prime used to be. The surface was dominated by Gothic spires that pierced the heavens, reaching toward a void they believed was filled with benevolent surveillance. These structures were megastructures of profound worship, constructed from the tireless labor of generations who believed their toil was a direct contribution to the celestial ledger. The corridors were sanctuaries of peace, echoing with the harmonious chants of the choristers. The air itself, though heavily processed, carried the scent of sacred incense, a stark contrast to the abrasive mixture of industrial soot and vaporized history that would eventually choke the atmosphere. Deep beneath the primary citadels, the planetary core hummed with stable, regulated energy, casting a warm, comforting luminescence through the subterranean shrines. The Society of Aurelius Prime operated under a beautifully orchestrated delusion. They believed in the absolute permanence of their sanctuary. The citizens, the clerics, the planetary governors, all move through their lives with the assuredness of those who think they are the protagonists. the protagonists of the universe's grand design. Valerius, too, shared this noble illusion. He walked among the throngs of the faithful, his towering frame casting a long, protective shadow. He was not merely a military commander, he was a spiritual lodestone. When he spoke, his voice resonated with the certainty of tectonic plates shifting into alignment. He preached the gospel of endurance, the virtue of the unwavering watch. He taught that the light of the throne was an impenetrable aegis, a barrier against the encroaching darkness of the outer void. But it is precisely within this golden falsehood that the seeds of unparalleled tragedy are sown. The very magnitude of their faith became the vulnerability that the cosmos would exploit. A fortress that believes itself impregnable stops looking for the subtle fractures in its foundation. The unwavering devotion of the Warden of the Silent Relics was a rigid structure, and rigid structures do not bend when the storm arrives. They shatter. His mind, so perfectly attuned to the frequency of divine righteousness, lacked the necessary flexibility to comprehend the sheer, senseless nihilism of the true enemy. The universe, in its infinite coldness, does not respect the purity of a saint. It only recognizes the malleability of matter and the fragility of sanity. Consider the millions of souls who inhabited the lower hives, the unformed generation of aspirants and initiates who looked to the spires with eyes full of desperate hope. They were the foundation upon which this golden falsehood was built. Among them were the men and women who would eventually become the Lamentation Corps, 100,000 penal conscripts whose destiny was not yet written in ash. In the golden era, they were simply the laborers, the maintainers of the great engines, the silent masses whose vital essence powered the infrastructure of paradise. Valerius viewed them with a detached benevolence, a fatherly sternness that masks the profound distance between his hallowed existence and their grinding reality. He believed his sacrifices were for them, never realizing that the true cost of their salvation would be measured in their own mass eradication. The first tremors of the great undoing were not heralded by the thunder of orbital bombardment or the chaotic arrival of hostile armadas. The unraveling began with a whisper. The atmospheric pressure of Aurelius Prime, normally regulated to a comfortable equilibrium, began to fluctuate with an unnatural rhythm. It was as though the planet itself was drawing a long, shuddering breath in anticipation of a fatal blow. The ancient voxcasters, designed to broadcast the names of the revered departed in a continuous loop of technological grace, began to experience microscopic stutters. These were not mechanical failures. They were the first subtle incursions of a demonic entity of pure nihilism. The Whispering Unmaker did not announce its presence with fire and brimstone. It slipped into the neuroacoustic pathways of the planetary communication grid. It was an invisible, self-replicating corruption of meaning. Valerius, standing within the sanctum of mourning, was the first to perceive the anomaly. The chants of the choristers seemed to lose their harmonic resonance, replaced by an underlying frequency of profound emptiness, the golden light of the binary sunset filtering through the stained glass windows appeared for a fleeting second to cast shadows that defied the geometry of the room. It was the universe beginning to test the structural integrity of the High Paladin's soul. In the annals of the Imperial Chronicler, it is understood that the most devastating sieges are not those that breach the outer walls, but those that dismantle the internal logic of the defenders. The entity known as the Whispering Unmaker targeted the very concept of the celestial ledger. It began to broadcast a subtle, insidious counter-narrative through the static of the Vox network. It spoke in the forgotten dialects of dead worlds, whispering the ultimate futility of resistance. It did not threaten physical harm. It promised an eternity of meaningless repetition. It showed the clerics visions of the vast, uncaring void, forcing them to confront the sheer mathematical insignificance of their devotions. For High Paladin Valerius, this was an ontological assault of unprecedented magnitude. He rallied his forces, mobilizing the planetary defense grid with the precision of a master tactician. He ordered the reinforcement of the subterranean munitions shrines and the activation of the primary void shields. But how does one fortify a perimeter against an enemy that resides within the very act of communication? How does one parry a blade that is forged from one's own existential dread? The golden falsehood began to peel away, revealing the rusted iron pillars and the tangled vine-like cables that had always underpinned their society. The transition from an era of glorious purpose to an epoch of suffocating despair was agonizingly slow. It was a spiritual attrition that wore down the defenders, not through catastrophic losses, but through the continuous, grinding realization that their hallowed duty was irrelevant to the cosmos. Valerius watched as his finest commanders, men and women of unshakable resolve, began to succumb to the suffocating weight of the Unmaker's philosophy. They did not fall in combat. They simply stopped. They lowered their weapons, uncoupled their power armor, and walked out into the toxic, violet clouds that had begun to gather in the upper atmosphere, seeking the silence of oblivion over the noise of a dying faith. He began to spend longer hours in the deepest levels of the cenotaph, far below the weeping gargoyles and the failing thermal sinks, here in the oppressive silence of the subterranean reliquaries. He sought guidance from the bones of the saints he was sworn to protect. He placed his gauntleted hands upon the stasis caskets, closing his eyes and projecting his mind into the immaterium, searching for a spark of the Emperor's light. But the immaterium was turbulent, choked with the static of a billion extinguished souls. The silence of the relics was absolute. They offered no strategic counsel, no comforting warmth. They were merely calcified remnants of a past that the Whispering Unmaker was actively rendering obsolete. This profound silence was the final confirmation of his isolation. Valerius realized that the chain of command, stretching all the way back to the Golden Throne, had been severed. He was alone, the sole custodian of a planetary-scale mausoleum that was rapidly collapsing inward under the pressure of its own meaningless existence. The millions of citizens above ground, now fully exposed to the psychic static of the enemy, were descending into a state of catatonic panic. The once harmonious society fractured into isolated enclaves of desperate survivalists, their prayers turning into frantic, nonsensical babble that only fed the Unmaker's power. To compensate for the loss of his commanders, Valerius was forced to rely on the basest elements of the planetary defense forces. The unformed generation, the aspirants and initiates, were prematurely elevated to the ranks of full defenders, their young minds ill-equipped to process the nihilistic warfare being waged against them. And below them, the Lamentation Corps was activated. The 100,000 penal conscripts were marched into the gravity pits and wired directly into the planetary defense grid. It was a decision that would haunt Valerius for the remainder of his days. He watched the massive tectonic chains being locked onto their flesh, witnessing the systematic harvesting of their vital essence to power the failing void shields. This was the true cost of endurance. It was not a glorious last stand. It was a methodical, industrial-scale sacrifice of the innocent, to buy a few more hours of agonizing existence. The High Paladin, the beacon of virtue, had become the architect of a great cleansing, sacrificing his own flock to forestall the inevitable. For 3 centuries, the siege of Aurelius Prime was not measured in the conventional metrics of warfare. It was not a conflict of moving front lines or tactical flanking maneuvers. It was a siege of spiritual attrition, an agonizing, slow-motion collapse of a planetary psyche. 300 standard years is a span of time that tests the absolute limits, a duration during which entire generations of the unformed generation were born, raised, and ultimately consumed by the grinding machinery of planetary defense. High Paladin Valerius endured this epoch of torment with a stoicism that bordered on the terrifying. His physical form became a secondary vessel, sustained entirely by the sheer, unyielding gravity of his duty. His venerated ceramite armor, once removed nightly for meticulous consecration, had long since fused with the hardened, scarred tissue of his mortal coil. He was no longer merely wearing the armor. He had become a living extension of the Citadel's defensive architecture, a biological anchor desperately trying to keep a sinking world tethered to the light of the throne. The physical deterioration of the cenotaph of Aurelius Prime mirrored the decaying mental state of its defenders. The colossal Gothic spires, which had once reached toward the heavens in a posture of arrogant devotion, now seemed to sag beneath the oppressive weight of the toxic, violet clouds. The architectural anatomy of the world was weeping. The gargoyles and statues of forgotten saints, carved into the adamantium facades of the macro cathedrals, constantly dripped with a caustic, acidic condensation that ate away at the stone. It was as if the planet itself was crying a steady stream of corrosive tears. The atmospheric pressure had risen to suffocating levels, forcing the remaining aspirants and neophytes to breathe through heavy industrial respirators that constantly hummed with the abrasive mixture of soot and vaporized history. To walk the corridors of the primary citadels was to navigate a labyrinth of ghosts, where the air was thick with the scent of failing ozone, and the silent, desperate prayers of a population waiting for an end that refused to come swiftly. The Whispering Unmaker, that demonic entity of pure nihilism, did not rush its grand design. It possessed the patience of a dying star. Its method of annihilation was a masterpiece of psychological dismantling. Through the ancient vox casters, it continued its relentless broadcast, a relentless broadcast of cosmic indifference. It did not project screams of pain or threats of physical torment. Instead, it whispered the cold, hard mathematics of the universe. It calculated the exact insignificance of the defenders' sacrifices, projecting these bleak equations directly into the neuroacoustic pathways of the clerics and commanders. And then, the impossible occurred. A massive fleet signature translated from the immaterium into real space. It was an armada of staggering proportions, but the universe specializes in exquisite betrayals. The sleek, predatory vessels were not a relief force. They were the obsidian-black cutters of the Ordo Malleus. Inquisitor Vane represented the cold, bureaucratic cruelty of an empire that would rather purge a saint than acknowledge his despair. He presented the terrifying logic of the Inquisition. To survive the Whispering Unmaker for so long, Valerius must have compromised his faith. Then came the final, devastating revelation. The massive fleet in orbit was an exterminatus fleet, sent to erase the entire planet from existence. The risk of the enemy claiming the relics was too great. The Empire's solution was the ultimate sanction: to burn the world to ash. This was the breaking point. The duty of a saint collided violently with the exhaustion of a mortal. The grand illusion shattered completely. The light of the throne was not a protective aegis. It was an all-consuming fire that viewed his life as acceptable fuel. He ceased to be the Warden. He ceased to be the hero. He became a hollow vessel, stripped of all loyalty and hope. In that moment of silent heresy, Valerius made his choice. He embraced the void, finding twisted comfort in the absolute certainty of the approaching end. The cold, calculated departure of Inquisitor Vane was a masterclass in indifference. High in the stratosphere, the exterminatus fleet unleashed the final sanction. It began with an absolute blinding radiance. Cylinders of condensed atmospheric igniters pierced the toxic clouds, igniting the very air itself. The sky of Aurelius Prime transformed into a continuous ocean of incandescent plasma. A cruel, poetic justice, mirroring the Emperor's hallowed grace. The descent of the firestorm was a systematic dismantling. The colossal Gothic spires did not merely collapse, they vaporized into the burning atmosphere. Deep beneath the disintegrating citadels, the subterranean munitions shrines reacted violently. The Lamentation Corps experienced their final, tragic release. The unformed generation stood in the suffocating heat of the collapsing corridors, their potential futures reduced to scattered atoms in a rapidly expanding cloud of debris. Within the sanctum of mourning, the temperature rose to catastrophic levels. High Paladin Valerius remained kneeling upon the frigid stone floor. He felt the heat penetrating his venerated ceramite armor. The ancient servo motors seized, locking him forever in his pose of catatonic exhaustion. He did not scream. He merely closed his eyes behind the cracked death mask. In his final apotheosis, he became one with the silence. The Warden of the Silent Relics was silenced himself, transformed by the roaring flames into a permanent, calcified monument of absolute despair. The Exterminatus fleet left behind a scarred, blackened sphere of glassy rock. The Empire had excised a tumor, desiring no memory of the surgical scar. It was a bureaucratic Exterminatus. High Paladin Valerius, the saint who held the line for 300 years, was reduced to a blank space in the archives. Yet a ghost story began to circulate. The myth of the Saint of Hollow Embers, a warning of what happens when a soul becomes too pure. Deep beneath the glassy, irradiated surface of the dead world, a single legacy remained, hidden in the fused, collapsed ruins. If you wish to survive the coming Dark Age, etch your name into our chronicles. Subscribe to the Imperial Chronicler and declare your allegiance in the comments below.